Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. We're continuing our episodes, Season 5, episodes that are strictly devoted to quick shots. Those are the short conversational responses to objections that are offered against Christianity. And as we talked about many times before, we have positioned these on our phone app, which is found by going to our website, and then you can click the tab, which will lead you over to our phone app download for both the Android platform and for iPhone. So that hopefully will be something you can use. We have increased our membership, almost doubled it since in the last 3 months. People who have downloaded the app and are now using it on a daily basis. And I hope you're one of those, because it's designed to help you, number one, learn and master the Christian worldview. That'd be nice, right? We talk about all the time about how most of us see ourselves as bearing a responsibility to share the gospel. We call this the Great Commission, right? And we feel that burden. We feel as though, hey, God has called us to do this in a number of places in the New Testament, to make disciples, to go out and make disciples. But at the same time, we don't always feel equipped, especially in a culture where now to share the gospel might mean having to answer questions. I don't have a problem sharing the gospel. People will tell me this all the time. I don't have a problem sharing the gospel. What I fear is that someone's going to ask me a question I can't answer. I totally understand. I totally get that. That's why we have to make a decision, because we are called. Now look, you might think, oh yeah, I'm called to be an evangelist, but then Paul tells us in Ephesians 2 that, not everyone is an evangelist. Some are called to be pastors, some teachers, some evangelists. That means that some of you aren't good and you're not gifted in those areas. And maybe you have you feel responsibility and you want to do some of that, but you're not gifted by God to do that. But Peter does not take us off the hook in 1 Peter 3, right, where he says that all of us, not some of us. Paul says some of you are evangelists, but Peter doesn't say some of you should be able to give the reason for the hope you have. He says that all of you should be able to give the reason for the hope you have. So if you feel a burden for evangelism, why don't you feel the same burden for Christian case making, this thing we call apologetics? That word, to make a defense, apologia, is in the verse in 1 Peter. I think we have to shift from just being Christians to being Christian case makers. And in my book, Cold Case Christianity, in the last chapter, I try to talk about that. We really, if we have accepted the first part of that, yes, I want to be a Christ follower, I call myself a Christian, but we have not accepted the second, which is commanded by Peter in Scripture, that we must be Christian case makers, then you're living an abbreviated Christian life. You haven't yet completed the call, right? Because you haven't yet decided to be a Christian case maker. And that is something you don't have an option. That's something you ought to be able to do. And that's why we do this show. That's why we have a website, coldcasechristianity.com. That's why all of us who work at the NRB TV, and you see a lot of really good apologists, I hate to use that word, Christian case makers, who have shows on this network for that reason. We believe, and so does the network, that we have to make a shift. And that we're in a culture right now in which evangelism is spelled apologetics. So we want to be able to make a defense. Now, what we're going to do today is continue an episode on Season 5 of our show, an episode that's going to answer another objection. And here's the objection for this week. We're simply going to answer the objection I hear all the time. It's become a popular internet meme that atheists believe in just one less God than Christians. I actually think that some of the objections to Christianity are pretty cool, in the sense that they are powerful, and they're rhetorically powerful, and sometimes they're pithy, they're funny, they're engaging. I can see why they're short, they're rhetorically powerful. There's the kind of thing you can lob across the net, and it's like, oh wow, what do I say to that? And this objection is, although I've only given it to you in a sentence, I want to just extend it a little bit. It's this idea that if I'm an atheist, I could say to you, look, I reject Christianity for the same reason that you reject the Norse gods or Greek mythology. You have a reason why you don't believe that every other god in history ever described by any people group is not true. Well, I'm with you. We agree on all those other gods. I also agree all those other gods are not real. And for the same reason why you don't believe that Greek mythological gods are real, I don't believe your Christian God or Yahweh is real either. In fact, you're an atheist like me about every other God. You're just not an atheist like me about your Christian God. You and I are a lot alike. I'm just like you, but I'm an atheist about one more God than you are. I believe in one less God than you. So that's the claim. And if you think about it, it's kind of rhetorically powerful. Now you might say you need to be able to respond to that kind of claim, because it's those rhetorically powerful on a visual world, visual memes that you see on social media have an impact. And to be able to say that as an atheist, I believe in just one less God than you, and I'm using the same criteria that you use to disband all the other gods, you're an atheist like me, except you haven't gone all the way yet. You ought to, because I'm using the exact same process. This kind of internet meme, when you make it visual, has an impact. Especially when so much, I mean, you know, if you're writing a blog, that if you want your article to do better, you include an image. Then when it's put on the internet, it's got the image, and the image sometimes is as compelling as anything else, and people will click it. You know, there are entire social media platforms that are entirely visual, like Instagram, Pinterest. The visual nature of short, rhetorically powerful objections allows them to travel at light speed compared to the responses we could give. And that's why we knew we needed to start to offer quick shots, quick, rhetorically powerful responses to the objections that we hear all the time. And I will tell you, if you're wondering about the objections that are heard, start to read the data in surveys of young people who are leaving the church. Because they'll often ask them, what was your barrier to belief? What was the thing that you didn't have a proper answer for? What are the reasons why you're leaving? And they will offer a number of objections that are the kinds of objections we're trying to respond to with this series. Let's take a break. When we come back, I'll answer this objection two ways. Again, we're trying to offer you two alternative ways to answer it so that you can find the one that either suits your hearer or suits you personally, and sometimes you're going to need both, because the answers to objections are almost always more robust. There are no silver bullet responses. You might be able to offer a set of responses quickly, but it usually will take a set and time to process. And again, what we're doing is removing barriers to belief. We're not necessarily going to get to the gospel. We might, but I think what happens is I want to show people at least that the view we hold as Christians is not unreasonable. You may still want to reject it, but it's not because it's stupid or unreasonable. It's because you've got a reason to reject it. And sometimes those reasons are not necessarily rational. They can be emotional or volitional. So let's return after this break, and we'll talk about the first response to this objection that atheists just believe in one less God than Christians.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
Sometimes we'll hear the objection by atheists, well, then who created God?
Right, and I've heard let's face it, when you work criminal trials, you're always looking for the ultimately responsible cause of any crime. So in the end, that person who is the cause of this is the person you're actually trying to find out who that is. And I think the question we hear asked all the time, well, if you're saying God caused the universe, who created God? God created the universe, who created God? There's a sense that it poses another problem for us as theists. Is how we can explain a God that is uncaused. But I want to just offer this, even as an atheist, all of us, and I was an atheist until I was 35, all of us are looking for the first uncaused cause. So if I'm an atheist today who believes in a primordial vacuum from which our universe is one of many that percolates up in the primordial vacuum, we're offering that vacuum is the eternal uncaused cause. But something is the uncaused first cause of everything else. And so we would say as Christians, and we get that, but by definition, our God is the uncaused creator of the universe. So it's to ask the question, well, who caused the first uncaused God, the creator of the universe? It's kind of a silly question to ask, because it's part of the definition that Christians hold of God's nature. He's the uncaused creator of the universe. So to ask a silly question like that really is rather nonsensical. But what I would offer is that all of us have the same dilemma. All of us, whether we're atheists or whether we're theists, are looking for the first uncaused cause of the universe. And if my offer is that this is best inferred as the creator God, or it's best inferred as the primordial vacuum from which many universes percolate, regardless of what you're offering, we're looking for the same thing, the first uncaused cause. I would just say that given the nature of our universe, the best and most reasonable inference is that that first uncaused cause is God. Based on the personal nature of we seem in a universe that has moral values, that seems to have the appearance of fine-tuning and design in biological systems. These are things that seem to be a product of choice. And we know that whatever can choose, that's an attribute of personhood. So I do think in the end, we're really weighing the contrast between, is this first uncaused cause personal or is it impersonal? If it's a personal cause, then we're stuck with a God very similar to what we see described in Scripture. So I think that would incline me at least toward theism, if not all the way to Christianity. I would at least have to reject the idea that there's an uncaused first cause that's not a personal God.
Far from blind faith.
Far from blind faith. Okay, so here's one way that I might respond to this objection that atheists believe in just one less God than Christians, and that atheists pretty much use the same process in which to discard Yahweh that we might use to discard, to discount, or to ignore, or to find invalidate any of the Greek gods, the Norse gods, any other god other than Yahweh. So let me give you on the screen so you can see it. This is one way you might respond to this objection. Take a look. Okay, this objection I think would be powerful, and that would be a powerful statement if all the other gods of history were equally reasonable or similarly documented or equally supported by evidence, but that isn't the case. If you examine the evidential support or the manuscript accounts, the manuscript evidence related to every other god described in history, guess what you're going to find? You're going to find that the evidence for Yahweh is vastly superior. I don't blame you for rejecting the case for the mythological gods of history. I do also. Like you said, we're similar in that way. I reject those claims just like you reject those claims. But make no mistake about this. The case for the God of the Bible is different, dramatically different, and considerably more reliable. Have you really examined the evidence that validates the claims of the Bible? Because it sounds like you think that all the evidence for all these gods is pretty much the same. Have you really looked at the evidence, though, for the existence of Yahweh or for the existence of Jesus or for the resurrection, any of the claims of the Bible? Now, what we want to do here is take the first obvious step. I get it. You reject some things that I also reject, but it's because there's no good reason to believe those things. But that isn't the situation with this. There are good reasons to believe this thing. There are good reasons for us to consider the claims of Scripture in a way that's different. And look, if you just look at the manuscript evidence, just at the number of manuscripts, how closely dated they are to the action, if you just looked at that, you would find that the manuscript evidence and the dating we have available to us of the earliest possible manuscripts is much closer to the events in the New Testament than even the events of the Old Testament. The manuscript evidence for Christianity is really good. The idea that Jesus never lived or that he was, these things are easily countered by just the evidence of manuscripts. I think the evidence for God's existence, and I wrote a whole book about this called God's Crime Scene, right? And in God's Crime Scene, I just go through 8 pieces of evidence in the universe that I think can only be explained by the existence of God. And I'm looking at disciplines like science and cosmology and biology and microbiology, and I'm looking at evidence of neurosciences and all of these things. And I think that the inference for God, now that book, I could have written that as any other kind of theist. In other words, the evidence for God's existence would also open the door to other notions of God. So God's Crime Scene is not a uniquely Christian book. All I've done there is demonstrate the existence of God. But then you have to take the extra step and look at the evidence for Christianity. So I think you can get to God's existence through the sciences, but you're going to have to look and examine the reliability of eyewitness accounts in the first century to determine if Jesus is really who he said he was. So I think to argue that the evidence, for example, for Greek mythological gods, the eyewitness accounts and the manuscript evidence we have that confirms the reliability of those accounts. Don't claim for a second, don't think for a second that they are somehow equal to what we have for Christianity. That's just ridiculous. That's just not true. This is an entirely, remember that Christianity is unique amongst religious worldviews. Other religious worldviews make claims that their prophets, their wise sages, their deities make statements. But Christianity makes claims that are rooted in history. If the resurrection didn't occur, then Christianity is false. And I don't care what good statements. Jesus could be as smart and make the kinds of statements that are just as compelling as Buddha. But if the resurrection didn't occur, the entire claims are this is why Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that's the most important piece of evidence you can look at, right? Is the claim related to the resurrection. So to claim that, hey, I've looked at all the gods and I'm going to reject Jesus for the same reason I reject all the other gods. Well, the difference in the character and nature of the evidence, you ought to reject those other gods, but you got to stop short here because the evidence by its very nature is very different for Jesus than it is for those other gods. You can't pretend like it's the same. So this first response we're giving is really just trying to capitalize on that distinction. Now, again, if you're going to make that distinction, what do you think is the first thing that your friend's going to say? He's going to say, oh, really? So what is the evidence? Show him, I've never seen any evidence. Now, look, there's a whole nother can of worms that we just opened up. And that's why I've written so much in books about what is the nature of evidence, what counts as evidence, how do we assemble cases evidentially, what's the difference between direct evidence and indirect evidence. You have to be able to master some of that, because when people say there's no evidence, it's because they don't understand what we use for evidence, which is, by the way, everything. Everything has the potential to be used as evidence. So once you know the rules of evidence and you start to read through Scripture, you go, oh wow, there's a lot of stuff here that I could use to make a case. And this is why when I work as a cold case detective, part of what I have to do, sometimes I get a case from 30 years ago and I look at it and I say, wow, this is a decent case. This was good 30 years ago, but the DA just couldn't see what I see. Or the first investigator doesn't see the power of that little statement or the power of that little thing. And so all I have to do is convince the district attorney now that, hey, do you realize what this means? And see something that's hidden in plain sight, right? Just see this little thing that has been overlooked for years because he didn't understand the nature of how he can make this case in front of a jury. So in the end, when someone says that there's no evidence for Jesus any more than there's evidence for any other ancient mythological god, it's probably because they don't understand the nature of evidence. This is why you and I need to understand the nature of evidence. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about another way you might respond to this objection that atheists believe in just one less God than Christians.
Now, it comes to sharing our faith, the entire world is broken into two groups. Believers, unbelievers. Those are also broken into two groups. Some believers are so committed to this that they don't even care if you got the body of Jesus and drug it around town in front of them. They are still going to believe because they don't care about the evidence. Then there are people who are having questions. They're believers, but they have questions. Then there are non-believers who are so adamant that during a presentation like this at Ohio State or at Michigan or wherever you're speaking on a campus, they're live tweeting profanity at you for the entire talk, right? I've had that happen.
Me too.
There you go.
That's
from your own congregation.
Last Sunday.
That's not right. And then you have people who are non-believers, but they have questions. Now, it turns out, as I'm speaking about the gospel to people, I recognize that I'm talking to all four groups, but only these three are paying attention. I call this the three-quarter principle. These three are paying attention.
Jay Warner and Susie Wallace have written 3 kids' books to help children know the truth and defend it in the public square. All 3 books mirror Jay Warner's adult books, chapter by chapter. And best yet, the kids' books are written as fictional stories that will turn your kids into detectives as they solve mysteries and learn about Christianity. There's also an interactive academy website at casemakersacademy.com where your kids can join other cadets and complete their own academy notebook. Each course has free videos, activity sheets, and more. Your young readers can even earn their own Junior Detective graduation certificates and appear on the Honor Cadet Wall. Be sure to visit casemakersacademy.com to learn more.
Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about the nature of evidence and what would count as evidence and why the evidence for Christianity is so different than the evidence for other claims related to God, even the mythological gods of antiquity, now I want to give you a slightly different approach. And this approach is going to be more of an analogy or a metaphor. Now look, there are some people who will reject analogies and metaphors and their explanatory ability, because that's just a metaphor. That's just a story you're telling. That's not evidence. I get it, but keep in mind that when we say that this is like this, and then we provide an example, number one, we are well within the Christian tradition, because how many times did Jesus offer a parable in order to explain a more complex theological issue? But not only that, we continue to do this in the sciences when we draw these visual metaphors for space-time, the fabric of time. These are ideas that we try to describe visually, even though it's just a visual or just a language analogy for something that's far more complex mathematically or scientifically. We all do this. We all do this. This is done in the sciences even today. So why would this not be an appropriate way to respond to any objection? I think it is. So let's go ahead and take that approach in our second response. Here it is on the screen. Okay, imagine that you're with me and I'm investigating a homicide, okay? And based on evidence, the evidence I have of the homicide, I conclude that there is a certain specific suspect who I identify as the killer. Now, we get to trial, he's arrested, and we go through all that process, and we get to trial, and a defense attorney for this suspect then asks the jury to reject the evidence that points to his client, the killer. And here's how he does it. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you dismiss all the other citizens of our community as the killer for the same reason I reject my client as the killer. As his attorney, I believe in just one less suspect than you." Okay. Can you see how silly that response would be in a criminal trial? I mean, duh, right? I mean, yes, there are many possible candidates for the suspect in the case, right? I get that. But only one is evidentially reasonable. And the fact that you dismiss a bunch of others that aren't evidentially reasonable does not mean that this one isn't. It doesn't matter how many other possible suspects there are. It simply matters that one of them is implicated by the evidence. Can you see why the evidence for the God of the Bible would matter more than the number of alternative suspects? Now, the reason why sometimes I will take time to use criminal analogies is not because I'm trying to leverage my job as a detective. I'll never forget the first time I taught the cold case Christianity class at Biola. I had a student who was honest enough to say that as he was sitting in the class, I think that I'm here, I want to hear what you have to say, but I kind of think this is a gimmick. I kind of think that your whole cold case Christianity approach is just a way to capitalize on the fact that you're a cold case detective. Kind of like if I was an electrician, I might have an electrician's case for God. I get it. But that's not why I write in the way I do and why I use these analogies. It turns out that all of us are examining a claim from the past, and we weren't there, we may not even have access anymore to the original eyewitnesses. But we are going to use some set of evidences to see if we can determine what happened in the past, and we're going to determine it to the level that we are willing to make a commitment and render a verdict. That to me is very similar to the process we go through as Christians, or as anyone evaluating the case for Christianity, to get to a point where this thing we think happened in the past drives us to make a decision, a verdict. I do think that these kinds of analogies about criminal trials are the perfect analogies for what we're talking about. And here's what's great about it, is the people you're talking to, they're interested in criminal trials. They're interested in detective stories. They watch this stuff on TV. Half the movies and television shows are all about cops doing this kind of work, detectives. So it's not as though people are unfamiliar. Now look, there's not a lot of television shows out there about what historians do. So I can make the case from the perspective of a historian, and I think a lot of people are going to be lost in the process. That's not something they're familiar with, but everyone is familiar from the days of Perry Mason all the way to now. They've seen these shows. They know what works in a jury. They know what they would do. They maybe have been on a... Who do you know who's been part of a historical investigation? How many people you know who have done jury duty? This ends up being a place that we can, experiences that we can tap into to help make the case. And clearly, if you had a defense attorney who was telling you that juries, you should reject my client as the suspect in this case because you've rejected everyone else as the suspect in this case, that's not going to work real well in a criminal trial for good reason. So I think we can use this example to show how silly that approach would be. And so I think in the end, that is a powerful way to at least overcome what at first feels like a rhetorically... Now, by the way, some of you have been watching this show. I've kind of maybe never heard that objection before that's been offered by atheists. But trust me, it's one of the more popular ones. And we need to be able to... I think that description of what would happen in a jury trial is rhetorically powerful enough to get you past this objection altogether. So I hope that helps you as you kind of think about how you would respond to another objection that's offered by unbelievers or by skeptics of Christianity, a quick shot response. And we'll come back here next week and give you more on the top 25 objections to the Christian worldview and how we can respond to those in a rhetorically powerful way that keeps the conversation going. We'll do that again here next week at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity, God's Crime Scene, Forensic Faith, and Alive.